There is a house in Derbyshire with more glass than wall. 6 towers rise from a hilltop ridge, and carved into the stone at the top of every single one of them are the same 2 letters. E.S. Elizabeth Shrewsbury. Not her father's name, not her birth name, the name she chose. But the woman who built this palace was not born to wealth or title. She was born to 26 pounds and a dead father in a family that had never produced anyone of consequence. She buried 4 husbands, outlasted a queen, and died the richest woman in England. This is how she did it, and what it cost her. Chapter 1: 26 pounds and a dead man's debts. In 1528, a man named John Hardwick died in a modest Derbyshire manor and left his infant daughter almost nothing. His name was not famous. His family was not powerful. The Hardwicks had held land in the parish of Alt Hucknall for generations, but they were minor gentry at best, farmers with pretensions, landowners who could seat themselves at the right tables, but never at the head of one. John Hardwick held a small estate, a few hundred acres of rolling Derbyshire pasture, and when he died, his eldest daughter Elizabeth was barely a year old, perhaps 2. The records are unclear because no one thought her birth was worth recording precisely. What is clear is the arithmetic. John Hardwick left debts. He left a widow named Elizabeth, just like her daughter, with 4 girls and a single infant son to raise. And he left a world that had very specific ideas about what happened to families like his when the father died. The Court of Wards stepped in. This was the Tudor machinery designed to manage the estates of dead men whose heirs were too young to manage them. In theory, the system protected orphaned children. In practice, it stripped them. The Crown appointed a guardian. The guardian managed the estate. The guardian collected the profits, and the family received whatever was left, which was often very little. The Hardwick estate was placed under wardship. The lands that should have sustained a widow and 5 children were now generating income for someone else. Young James Hardwick, the only son, became a commodity. His marriage rights could be sold. His lands could be leased. His future belonged to the Crown until he came of age, and the daughters received almost nothing. Bess's portion of her father's estate amounted to 26 pounds, 13 shillings, and 4 pence. Write that number down. Remember it, because every single thing that follows in this story begins with that figure. 26 pounds in 1528 had roughly the purchasing power of 8,000 pounds today. Enough to survive on for a year or 2 if you were careful. Not enough to change your life. Not enough to attract a serious marriage offer. Not enough to do anything except watch the world happen to you. This was the mathematics of being female in Tudor England. A son inherited the land. Daughters inherited portions, small fixed sums meant to serve as their contribution to a future marriage settlement. If the estate was large, the portions were generous. If the estate was small and burdened with debt, the portions were a polite way of saying you were on your own. Bess was on her own. We know very little about her childhood. The Hardwick Manor house still partially exists, embedded within the ruins of what Bess would later build on the same site. It was a modest building, stone walls, small windows, cold rooms in winter. This was not the childhood of a great lady. This was the childhood of a girl who understood, from the earliest age she could understand anything, that the world owed her nothing and would give her less. Her mother remarried. This was not sentiment. This was survival. A widow with 5 children and a diminished estate needed a husband, and Elizabeth Hardwick found one in Ralph Lesha, a local gentleman of modest means. The marriage brought stability, but not wealth. Bess grew up in a household that was respectable but stretched thin. Every meal was accounted for. Every decision was economic. And somewhere in that careful, watchful childhood, Bess learned the lesson that would define her entire life. She learned that land was the only thing that lasted. Money could be spent. Husbands could die. Titles could be stripped. But land endured. And whoever controlled the land controlled everything. She was perhaps 12 or 13 when she left home. The custom among gentry families was to place daughters in the households of wealthier relations, where they would learn the arts of household management, make useful connections, and ideally attract the attention of a suitable husband. Bess was sent to the household of the Zouche family, and later, almost certainly, to the grand household of Lady Frances Grey. It was there, in the corridors and counting rooms of greater houses, that Bess began to see the architecture of power. Not the politics, not the courtly intrigue, the architecture, the physical reality of wealth made stone, the estates that anchored a family across generations, the difference between a house and a dynasty. She had come from 26 pounds and a dead man's debts. She intended to end somewhere very different, but first she needed a husband, and the one she found was barely old enough to stand at the altar. Chapter 2: The Boy Who Died Before the Wedding Night. Bess's first husband was 13 years old, and he would be dead within a year. His name was Robert Barlow, or Barley. The records vary because the family was so obscure that even their surname was unstable. He was the son of a minor Derbyshire gentleman, and the marriage was arranged sometime around 1543, when Bess was perhaps 15 or 16. This was not a love match. It was not even, in any meaningful sense, a marriage. It was a legal maneuver designed to protect two vulnerable families from the same predatory system that had devoured Bess's father's estate. Robert Barlow was a ward of the crown. Like young James Hardwick, his father had died and left an underage heir, and the Court of Wards had claimed control of the boy's marriage rights. Whoever held Robert's wardship could sell his marriage to the highest bidder, pocketing the profit while the boy had no say in who he married or what happened to his lands. The Barlow family wanted to keep control. They wanted Robert married to someone they chose, someone who would not strip the estate. And Bess's family wanted their daughter settled, however modestly. The match suited everyone. Two minor families, both bruised by the wardship system, joining together in mutual defense. The ceremony happened. The boy and the girl stood before a priest. And then Robert Barlow went home to his family, and Bess went home to hers, because neither of them was old enough for the marriage to be consummated, and Robert was already ill. He died within months, perhaps a year. The exact date is lost because, once again, no one considered it important enough to record with precision. A sickly boy from an obscure family died young in Derbyshire, and the world did not pause. But for Bess, the death of Robert Barlow was not a tragedy. It was an education. She was now a widow, and in Tudor England, a widow occupied a legal position that no other woman could claim. A married woman owned nothing. Under the doctrine of coverture, her property, her income, her body, and her legal identity belonged entirely to her husband. She could not sign contracts. She could not buy or sell land. She could not go to court in her own name. She was, in the eyes of the law, absorbed into her husband, erased. But a widow was free. A widow could own property. A widow could manage her own affairs. A widow could negotiate, litigate, buy, sell, and build. A widow was the only woman in England who existed as a full legal person. Bess had stumbled into this freedom almost by accident, through a marriage that lasted barely long enough to count. Robert Barlow left her very little, a small income, a minor claim on his family's lands, nothing that would change the scale of her life. But the principle was everything. She had learned the most dangerous truth available to a woman in 16th century England. Marriage made you property. Widowhood made you powerful. And if you were clever enough, you could use one to reach the other, over and over again, until the accumulated wealth of dead husbands built something permanent. Some historians have read coldness into this. A woman who married for money, who calculated the value of each husband against the freedom his death would bring. But this reading ignores the brutal simplicity of Bess's options. She could not inherit. She could not earn. She could not hold office or practice a trade. The only wealth available to a woman of her class came through marriage, and the only way to keep that wealth came through outliving the man who provided it. Bess did not invent this system. She simply understood it better than anyone else alive. And she was about to meet a man whose wealth dwarfed anything the Barlows could have imagined. A man who had grown rich by tearing apart the Catholic Church, stone by stone, altar by altar, and selling everything he found inside. He was twice her age. He was already powerful. And Bess intended to redirect every penny he had earned toward a patch of Derbyshire hillside she had never forgotten. Chapter 3: The Man Who Stole from Monasteries. William Cavendish had grown rich by dismantling the Catholic Church, and Bess intended to spend every penny of it. They married in 1547. Bess was roughly 20. Cavendish was 47, a widower twice over with children from both previous marriages, a man deep in the machinery of the Tudor state and thoroughly stained by it. He was one of the commissioners appointed by Henry VIII to oversee the dissolution of the monasteries, the vast program of confiscation that had transferred the wealth of England's religious houses into the hands of the Crown and its allies. Cavendish had excelled at this work. He had traveled the country assessing monastic properties, valuing their assets, and overseeing their surrender. He had also, with the quiet efficiency that characterized every stage of his career, ensured that significant portions of that wealth found their way into his own hands. He bought former monastic lands at favorable prices. He acquired estates that had once belonged to abbots and priors. He built a fortune on the rubble of churches. This was not unusual. Half the great families of Elizabethan England owed their rise to the dissolution. The Russells, the Cavendishes, the Thynnes, the Seymours. The new aristocracy of the 16th century was built on stolen altars and melted down communion plate. Cavendish was simply one of many men who understood that the greatest transfer of wealth in English history was also the greatest opportunity. But Cavendish had a problem. He was careless with money. His accounts as a commissioner were a mess. There were discrepancies. There were funds that could not be explained. The Crown had questions, and Cavendish did not have good answers. He needed to move his assets somewhere safe, somewhere difficult to seize, somewhere that looked like established family wealth rather than recently acquired plunder. He needed land, and Bess knew exactly where to put it. Within months of their marriage, Bess had persuaded Cavendish to sell his properties in the south of England and reinvest the money in Derbyshire. The move made no obvious sense for a man whose career was centered on London and the court. Derbyshire was remote. It was unfashionable. It was far from the centers of power. But it was where Bess came from, and Bess understood something about power that Cavendish, for all his experience, had never grasped. Power in London depended on the favor of whoever sat on the throne. Power in the countryside depended on the land beneath your feet. In 1549, they purchased the estate of Chatsworth. The price was £600. The site was a gentle slope above the River Derwent, surrounded by some of the finest parkland in Derbyshire. It was beautiful, it was substantial, and it was close enough to Hardwick that Bess could see, every time she looked east, the land where her father had died and left her nothing. She began building immediately. Not the Chatsworth we know today, which was rebuilt in the 17th century, but the first great house on that site. Bess directed the construction personally. She chose the stone. She hired the craftsmen. She kept the accounts. Cavendish provided the money, but the vision was entirely hers. Over the next 8 years, Bess bore Cavendish 8 children. 6 survived infancy. She managed the construction of Chatsworth. She oversaw the family's growing portfolio of Derbyshire properties. She ran a household that consumed enormous quantities of food, fuel, and labor. And she did all of this while her husband spent increasing amounts of time in London, trying to keep his career afloat as the political winds shifted from Henry to Edward to the brief and bloody reign of Lady Jane Grey. Bess was becoming, in everything but title, the head of her own household. She was learning how to manage not just a home, but an enterprise. She was learning the cost of stone and timber. She was learning how to negotiate with craftsmen and suppliers. She was learning the rhythms of construction, the seasonal patterns of building work, the difference between ambition and execution. And then, in 1557, William Cavendish died. He left behind a great deal of property. He also left behind a great deal of debt. The Crown's questions about his accounts as a monastic commissioner had never been resolved, and at his death, the family owed the treasury roughly £5,000. This was an enormous sum. It threatened to consume everything Bess had built. But Bess did not panic. She negotiated, she petitioned. She used every connection she had cultivated during her years at the edges of the court. And over the following years, she steadily reduced the debt, protected the Derbyshire estates, and ensured that the inheritance she had constructed for her children remained intact. She was 30 years old. She had buried 2 husbands. She had 6 children, a great estate under construction, and a fortune that was substantial but precarious. She needed one more marriage to make it all secure. What she found instead was something she had never planned for. She found a man who loved her. Chapter 4. The husband she actually loved. Sir William St. Lo adored Bess, and someone in his family may have tried to murder her for it. They married around 1559, and from the beginning, this marriage looked different from the others. St. Lo was a soldier and courtier. He served as captain of the guard to Elizabeth I, a position of genuine trust and proximity to the throne. He was wealthy, he was well connected, and his letters to Bess survive, addressed to "my own sweet Bess" and "my honest sweet Chatsworth," using her estate as a term of endearment, as though the woman and her house were already indistinguishable. For the first time in her life, Bess appeared to have married someone she genuinely liked. The practical advantages were enormous. St. Lo's income consolidated her position. His closeness to the Queen provided political protection. His willingness to let Bess manage the combined finances gave her the operational freedom she craved. But the tone of their correspondence suggests something beyond calculation. These were 2 people who enjoyed each other's company. However, St. Lo's family did not enjoy Bess's company at all. His brother, Edward St. Lo, saw the marriage as a catastrophe. William had daughters from a previous marriage. Those daughters expected to inherit their father's estate. And now, a formidable woman from Derbyshire had inserted herself between them and their inheritance, and everyone who knew Bess understood that she would not be content with a modest widow's portion. The trouble began almost immediately. Bess fell violently ill at some point during the early years of the marriage. The symptoms suggested poisoning. Suspicion fell on Edward St. Lo, who was subsequently arrested and charged with attempting to murder his brother's wife. The details are murky. Tudor legal records are incomplete, and the case never produced a definitive outcome. But someone wanted Bess dead, and the most likely reason was money. Edward St. Lo was not finished. He also attempted to poison his own mother, apparently in an effort to accelerate his share of the family estate. The mother survived. Edward was convicted and imprisoned. The entire affair reveals the lethal stakes of family wealth in Tudor England. Inheritance was not an abstract legal question. It was a matter of life and death, and people killed for it. Bess survived the attempt. She always survived, and she continued doing what she had done in every marriage. She worked. She managed the estates. She continued building at Chatsworth. She negotiated the labyrinth of court politics with her husband's help. She expanded the family's holdings. She planned. And then, around 1565, Sir William St. Lo died. The circumstances were not obviously suspicious. He was not old, but Tudor life expectancy was brutal. Men died of infections, fevers, accidents, and diseases that would be trivial today. St. Lo's death may have been entirely natural, or it may not have been. The timing was convenient for no one except Bess, and this is the kind of coincidence that historians have noted without being able to resolve. What is not ambiguous is what St. Lo did before he died. He rewrote his will. He left his entire estate to Bess, not to his daughters from his first marriage, not divided among his family. Everything went to his wife. This was extraordinary. It was also, by the standards of the time, shocking. St. Lo's daughters were left with nothing from their father's estate. They would fight the will for years. They would lose. Bess kept everything. The fortune this brought her was staggering. Combined with the Cavendish estates, the Barlow income, and her own accumulated investments, Bess was now one of the wealthiest people in England. Her annual income approached £60,000 in modern equivalent, perhaps £20 million today. She owned land across multiple counties. She had connections at the highest levels of the court. She had 6 children approaching marriageable age, each of whom represented a dynastic opportunity. She was perhaps 35 years old. She had buried 3 husbands. She had started with £26 and a dead father's debts, and she was only halfway to where she intended to go. The mathematics of her rise were astonishing. In roughly 20 years, Bess had increased her personal wealth by a factor that defied anything her birth should have permitted. She had done it not through inheritance, not through royal favor, not through any of the conventional routes available to men of ambition. She had done it through marriage, through widowhood, through the ruthless exploitation of the only economic mechanism available to a woman of her class. But now she wanted something more than wealth. She wanted permanence. She wanted a title. She wanted the kind of social position that would make her family untouchable. She wanted her children married into the aristocracy, and her grandchildren connected to the throne itself. She wanted, in other words, to marry the richest earl in England. And when she found him, she believed she had finally won. She had no idea that this marriage, the one that should have completed her triumph, would become the worst disaster of her life. Chapter 5. The Earl, the Queen, and the Prisoner. When Bess married the richest earl in England, she thought she had won everything, but the Queen had a gift for them that would destroy it all. George Talbot, 6th Earl of Shrewsbury, was the greatest catch in the country. His income was enormous. His estates stretched across 6 counties. His title was ancient, and his loyalty to the crown was unquestioned. When Bess married him in 1568, she achieved the social elevation she had pursued for 20 years. She was now a countess. Her children were now the stepchildren of an earl. But Bess, characteristically, was not content with a simple marriage. She arranged a double wedding. On the same day she married Shrewsbury, her eldest son, Henry Cavendish, married Shrewsbury's daughter, Grace, and her daughter, Mary Cavendish, married Shrewsbury's son, Gilbert. 3 marriages in a single ceremony, 2 families bound together at 3 separate points. This was a masterstroke. It meant that the Cavendish and Talbot fortunes were now intertwined at every level. It meant that Bess's grandchildren would carry both bloodlines. It meant that, regardless of what happened to any individual marriage, the families could never be fully disentangled. Shrewsbury, by all accounts, was initially delighted with his new wife. Bess brought energy, intelligence, and her considerable management skills to his household. She brought her children, and her ambitions, and her money. The combined income of the Shrewsbury and Cavendish estates made them the wealthiest couple in England outside the royal family. And then, in 1569, Queen Elizabeth gave them a gift. Mary, Queen of Scots, had fled across the border from Scotland the previous year, seeking refuge from the Protestant lords who had deposed her. Elizabeth could not send her back. She could not let her leave. And she could not keep her at court, where the Catholic Queen would become a magnet for every plot against the English throne. Elizabeth needed a jailer, someone loyal, someone wealthy enough to absorb the cost, someone with estates remote enough to keep Mary away from the centers of conspiracy. She chose Shrewsbury. It seemed like an honor. It was a catastrophe. For the next 15 years, George and Bess Talbot were responsible for the custody of the most dangerous prisoner in England. Mary was not a common captive. She was a queen. She required a household befitting her rank. She required servants, attendants, cooks, guards, furnishings, and accommodation that matched her status. She required, in short, an enormous and constant expenditure of money. Elizabeth promised to cover the costs. She lied. The allowance the crown provided was perpetually inadequate and perpetually late. Shrewsbury petitioned for more. He wrote letters of increasing desperation. He detailed the expenses. He begged for relief. The Queen sent sympathetic replies and insufficient funds. The numbers were devastating. Shrewsbury estimated the cost of keeping Mary at £52 per week. That is nearly £2,700 per year in 16th century money. Over 15 years, the total expense may have reached £40,000 or more. This was a fortune large enough to break even the richest earl in England, and it did break him. Shrewsbury began to deteriorate. His letters describe constant pain, gout, strange swellings in his limbs, fevers. Modern historians have speculated about everything from rheumatoid arthritis to the psychological effects of sustained stress. Whatever the cause, the Shrewsbury who had married Bess with such optimism in 1568 was, by the mid-1570s, a physically ruined and increasingly paranoid man. He began to resent Bess. This was partly financial. Bess continued to build at Chatsworth, expending money that Shrewsbury felt should be conserved for Mary's maintenance. It was partly personal. Bess was strong, capable, and unwilling to subordinate herself. Shrewsbury wanted a wife who deferred. Bess had never deferred to anyone, and it was partly about Mary herself. The constant presence of a beautiful, manipulative queen under his roof created tensions that neither husband nor wife could resolve. Rumors circulated. Whispers reached the court. Some said Shrewsbury had become too close to his prisoner. Some said Mary and the Earl shared more than a jailer's duty. These rumors were almost certainly false, but they poisoned everything. By the early 1580s, the marriage had become a war. Shrewsbury accused Bess of financial manipulation. Bess accused Shrewsbury of cruelty. The Earl told anyone who would listen that his wife was trying to control him. Bess told anyone who would listen that her husband had abandoned his duties to his family. The situation had become so extreme that it was no longer a private matter. And what happened next would make the most powerful woman in England choose between her marriage and everything she had built. Chapter 6. The War Between Husband and Wife. The Earl accused Bess of trying to make herself the husband and him the wife, and he was not entirely wrong. By 1583, the Shrewsbury marriage had descended into open warfare. Not metaphorical warfare, actual physical confrontation. Shrewsbury arrived at Chatsworth with 40 armed and mounted men. His intention was to seize the house. Bess's servants barred the doors. The Earl raged outside. His men surrounded the building. For a brief, absurd, terrifying moment, one of the greatest houses in Derbyshire was under siege by the man who nominally owned it. This was not how things were supposed to work. A husband, under coverture, controlled his wife's property. Chatsworth belonged to Shrewsbury by law, but Bess had spent years making the house functionally hers. She had built it, she had managed it, she had filled it with her servants, her furnishings, her accounts, and she was not about to hand it over to a man she no longer trusted. The Queen intervened. Elizabeth appointed not one, but 2 royal commissions to investigate the Shrewsbury marriage and determine a settlement. This was unprecedented. Domestic disputes, even among the aristocracy, did not normally require royal investigation. But the Shrewsbury fortune was so vast, and the implications of the dispute so tangled with the custody of Mary Queen of Scots, that the private war between husband and wife had become a matter of state. The commissions attempted compromise. Shrewsbury was ordered to provide Bess with a maintenance allowance of £500 per year. He was ordered to return her personal possessions. He was ordered to treat her with the respect due to a countess. He agreed. He signed a bond of £40,000 guaranteeing his compliance. And then he broke every promise almost immediately. The allowance went unpaid. The possessions were not returned. Shrewsbury continued to rage against Bess in letters to the court, accusing her of ambition, manipulation, and the emasculation of his authority. He called her "my wicked and malicious wife." He compared himself to a man trapped by a serpent. Bess fought back with the only weapon she had, information. She circulated the scandal of Shrewsbury's alleged intimacy with Mary Queen of Scots. She ensured that the court knew every detail of her husband's cruelty. She used her network of allies and servants to maintain pressure on a man who had the legal power to destroy her, but lacked the will to do it cleanly. Meanwhile, Bess was doing something far more significant than winning a domestic argument. She was preparing for the possibility that she would lose everything, and she was doing it in the most characteristically Bess way imaginable. She was buying land. In 1583, the same year her husband besieged Chatsworth, Bess purchased the Hardwick estate. Her brother James had died. The property was bankrupt. The manor house, where Bess had been born, was falling apart. The land that the Court of Wards had stripped from her family 50 years earlier was now available for sale. Bess paid £9,500. This was dramatically more than the estate was worth. A fair price might have been £3,000 or £4,000. But Bess was not buying a piece of land at market value. She was buying a story. She was buying the right to return to the place where she had started with nothing and rebuild it as a monument to everything she had become. She began repairs to the old hall immediately, quietly, methodically, keeping the accounts herself, preparing for the day when she would need somewhere to go if Chatsworth was lost. Shrewsbury died in November 1590. The marriage had effectively been over for years. Bess had been living at Hardwick, managing her estate separately, building and planning and waiting. When the news of his death reached her, she did not mourn. She moved. Within days, she had sent agents to secure her share of the Shrewsbury estate. The legal battles with the Talbot family would continue for years, but Bess's immediate priority was clear. She had money again. She had freedom. She was a widow for the fourth and final time. And she had a piece of land on a Derbyshire ridge where the wind never stopped, and the views stretched for 30 miles in every direction. She had been thinking about what to build there for years. Now she was going to build it. Chapter 7. A palace built from the bones of 4 marriages. Shrewsbury died on the 18th of November, 1590, and Bess began building before his body was cold. This is not a metaphor. The construction accounts for Hardwick New Hall show expenditures beginning almost immediately after Shrewsbury's death. Bess had been planning this building during the final years of her marriage. She had the designs. She had the stone. She had the labor force already assembled from the ongoing repairs to the old hall. The moment the financial constraints of her marriage were lifted, she began. She hired Robert Smytheson. This is a name that matters. Smytheson was not a builder or a master mason, though he had started as one. He was, in the judgment of architectural historians, England's first true architect. He had designed Longleat for Sir John Thynne and Wollaton Hall for Sir Francis Willoughby. He understood proportion. He understood light. And he understood something that no other designer in England fully grasped: that a building could be a statement of philosophy, not merely a container for living. What Bess and Smytheson created together was unlike anything England had seen. The design was revolutionary. Traditional great houses placed their chimneys on exterior walls, which meant the outside of the building was broken up by chimney stacks, and the interior spaces near those walls were warm but dark. Smytheson moved the chimneys to the interior walls. This freed the entire exterior of the building for windows, and Bess wanted windows. She wanted more glass than anyone had ever put in a private house. She wanted light flooding every room. She wanted the walls of her home to dissolve into transparency, so that the Derbyshire landscape became part of the interior, and the interior became visible to anyone who stood outside and looked up. The floor plan encoded a social hierarchy into the physical structure of the building. The ground floor had the lowest ceilings and the least light. It was for servants and storage. The first floor was higher and brighter. It was for the family. The second floor, the top of the house, had the tallest ceilings and the most glass. It was for Bess. This was an inversion of conventional design. In most great houses, the grandest rooms were on the ground or first floor, easily accessible to visitors. Bess put her staterooms at the top of the building, requiring visitors to climb through 2 full stories before reaching her presence. The ascent itself was the message. Coming to see Bess of Hardwick was a pilgrimage upward. Each step took you farther from the common ground and closer to the woman who had risen above everything. The hall ran front to back through the center of the house, dividing it into symmetrical halves. This was Smithson's innovation. Traditional halls ran side to side, creating an awkward relationship between the entrance and the service areas. The central axis at Hardwick created a clean line of sight from the front door through the house and out the other side, a corridor of controlled movement that channeled visitors exactly where Bess wanted them to go. The construction workforce was substantial. Masons, carpenters, glaziers, plasterers, and laborers worked on the site for 4 consecutive years. Their marks are still visible on the stones. Each mason carved a personal symbol into the blocks he cut. It's a system of quality control and payment tracking that has allowed historians to identify individual craftsmen working on specific sections of the building. The stone came from the ridge itself. Hardwick sits on a deposit of honey-colored sandstone, and Bess quarried it from the same hilltop on which the house stands. The building literally rises from its own foundations. The stone beneath the floors is the same stone that forms the walls, which is the same stone that lines the ridge stretching away in both directions. Hardwick does not sit on the landscape. It emerges from it. Bess supervised everything. She reviewed the accounts daily. She inspected the work. She made decisions about placement, proportion, and material. And she did this while simultaneously managing coal mines, lead mines, glass workshops, and agricultural estates spread across Derbyshire, Nottinghamshire, and beyond. She was in her 60s. She was conducting the most ambitious building project of the Elizabethan age, and she was running a business empire that would have overwhelmed most men half her age. The glass alone was an extraordinary expense. In a country where window glass was a luxury that most people never touched, Bess was filling an entire hilltop with it. She operated her own glass workshops to keep costs manageable, but the scale of glazing at Hardwick was still staggering. The windows are enormous. Some rise 2 full stories. They let in so much light that the interior of the house has a quality unlike any other building of its era. It glows. And at the top of the 6 towers, Bess carved her initials into the stone parapets. E.S. Elizabeth Shrewsbury, visible for miles across the Derbyshire countryside. Not hidden, not modest, not tucked into a cornerstone or a mantelpiece. Displayed against the sky itself, so that anyone approaching from any direction would know, before they knew anything else, whose house this was. She was building her name into the horizon. Chapter 8. More glass than wall. In a country where glass was a luxury, Bess filled an entire hilltop with it, and then she carved her name across the sky. Hardwick New Hall was substantially complete by 1597. The building that Bess and Smithson had conceived was now standing on its Derbyshire ridge, and nothing in England looked like it. The rhyme that would follow the house through the centuries was already forming on people's lips. Hardwick Hall, more glass than wall. The interiors were designed to overwhelm. The high great chamber on the second floor had ceilings that rose 25 feet above the floor. The walls were hung with the Gideon tapestries, a series of 8 enormous Brussels tapestries depicting the Old Testament story of Gideon's victory. They were among the finest tapestries in England, and Bess had acquired them specifically for this room. The plasterwork above them, a continuous frieze of figures from the court of Diana, ran the entire perimeter of the chamber, creating a canopy of mythological imagery that pressed down on anyone who entered. This room was not for living. It was for being received. Visitors who had climbed 2 stories to reach Bess's presence would enter the high great chamber and find themselves beneath 25 feet of decorated ceiling, surrounded by tapestries that told a story of divinely appointed victory, standing on a floor that placed them physically below the raised dais where Bess would sit. The long gallery stretched 166 feet along the entire east front of the building. It was the longest room in any Elizabethan house. 89 portraits hung along its walls, depicting the network of power, ancestry, and ambition that Bess had spent her lifetime weaving. The gallery was flooded with light from the enormous east-facing windows. Walking its length was like walking through the interior of Bess's mind. Every portrait a calculation, every face a connection. The inventory of the house, taken in 1601, records the contents of every room with obsessive precision. The sea dog table, with its carved marine creatures supporting a surface inlaid with musical instruments and geometric designs. The embroidered hangings that Bess and Mary Queen of Scots had stitched together during the long years of captivity. 2 women who detested each other's significance, working side by side with needles and thread. The bed hangings, the cushions, the silver, the pewter, everything counted, everything recorded, everything placed exactly where Bess wanted it. The numbers that define Hardwick at the peak of Bess's power tell their own story. Her annual income was approximately £10,000. The construction of the new hall cost roughly £3,000 over 4 years. She maintained both the old hall and the new hall simultaneously, running 2 great households on the same hillside. She employed hundreds of workers. She fed the household from her own estates, consuming enormous quantities of beef, mutton, bread, and beer, all produced on Cavendish lands. And she did this during a famine. The harvests of 1594, 1595, 1596, and 1597 were catastrophic. England experienced 4 consecutive years of crop failure, the worst food crisis of the 16th century. Grain prices doubled and then doubled again. The poor starved. In some parts of the country, the death rate spiked by 25%. People ate grass, people ate bark, people died in the fields. Bess never stopped building. Her income fell. How could it not? Agricultural rents were based on harvests, and the harvests had failed. Her income dropped by roughly 25% during the worst years. But she continued construction. She continued employing her workers. She continued buying glass and stone and timber. The accounts show no pause, no interruption, no moment where the famine outside the gates of Hardwick caused the woman inside them to reconsider. There are 2 ways to read this. The generous reading is that Bess's continued construction provided employment to hundreds of workers during a period when work was scarce. The wages she paid kept families alive. The household she maintained consumed food that might otherwise have gone to waste. In a rural economy without a welfare state, the great house was the safety net, and Bess kept hers running. The less generous reading is that Bess built a glass palace while her neighbors starved. That the same woman who had started with 26 pounds and understood the arithmetic of poverty chose to spend 3,000 pounds on a house she did not need while the people of Derbyshire were eating tree bark. That the monument to her refusal to be forgotten was built during a period when forgetting where your next meal was coming from was a daily reality for the ordinary people who lived in the shadow of her towers. Both readings are true. That is what makes Bess's story complicated. She was extraordinary. She was ruthless. She was both at the same time, and neither cancels the other out. The house stood complete. 6 towers, more glass than wall. The initials ES carved against the Derbyshire sky. The most audacious domestic building project of the Elizabethan age, conceived by a woman who started with nothing and built with the accumulated wealth of 4 dead husbands. It was her triumph. It was her monument, and it would outlast her. But there was one element of her grand plan that she could not control. One piece of her dynastic machine that refused to function as designed: her granddaughter. Chapter 9: The Granddaughter She Could Not Control. Arbella Stuart carried royal blood in her veins, and it would destroy her. She was the daughter of Charles Stuart, Bess's youngest son from her second marriage, who had married Elizabeth Lennox in a union that Bess had engineered without the Queen's permission. The Lennox family carried a claim to the English throne through their descent from Henry VII. When Charles and Elizabeth produced a daughter, that child was born with royal blood and a grandmother who intended to use it. This was Bess's most audacious gamble. She was not merely building a fortune. She was not merely constructing a great house. She was engineering a dynasty that might, if the cards fell correctly, place her own blood on the throne of England. Elizabeth I was unmarried and childless. The succession was the most dangerous question in English politics. Multiple candidates existed, including James of Scotland, who would eventually inherit, but Arbella Stuart, born in England, raised in England, and controllable by her grandmother, was a plausible alternative. Bess positioned her granddaughter accordingly. She raised Arbella at Hardwick. She educated her. She kept her visible enough to matter and quiet enough to avoid Elizabeth's wrath. But Arbella was not a chess piece. She was a person, and the life that Bess had designed for her was a prison. Arbella could not marry. Any marriage would be a political act, potentially a treasonous one, since it would create an alliance that might threaten the throne. Elizabeth watched her closely. Bess watched her more closely. The girl grew up in the vast glass house on the Derbyshire Ridge, surrounded by wealth and tapestries and servants, and could not leave. By the late 1590s, Arbella was in her 20s and desperate. She had spent her entire life as a piece in someone else's game. Her grandmother's game, the Queen's game, the game of succession and dynasty and political survival. She had never been allowed to be anything other than a potential queen, and the potential was consuming her. In 1602, Arbella broke. She attempted to arrange her own marriage. She sent messages to potential husbands. She plotted, she planned, and it all fell apart spectacularly because Bess found out. The confrontations at Hardwick were violent, not physically, emotionally. An aging woman of roughly 75 and a desperate young woman of 27, trapped together in a glass house on a hilltop, fighting over the same question that had defined Bess's entire life. Who gets to control a woman's future? Bess saw Arbella as ungrateful. She had given the girl everything: wealth, education, a position that millions would have envied. All Arbella had to do was wait. Wait for the queen to die. Wait for the moment to be right. Wait for her grandmother to tell her what to do. Arbella saw Bess as a jailer. She had been given everything except freedom. She lived in the finest house in Derbyshire and could not choose her own husband. She carried royal blood and could not use it. She was the most prominent woman in England outside the court, and she was not allowed to leave her grandmother's house. Henry Cavendish, Bess's eldest son, tried to help Arbella escape. One night, he arrived at Hardwick with a group of men, intending to take Arbella away. They reached the porter's lodge, and there, Bess's servant stopped them, on Bess's orders. The grandmother who had built her entire life on the principle of freedom through wealth and widowhood used her wealth and her servants to deny her granddaughter the freedom to leave. Think about that. The woman who had escaped poverty, survived 4 marriages, outwitted an earl, and built a glass palace through sheer force of will, now stood on the other side of the equation. She had become the cage. Arbella eventually left Hardwick after Bess's death. James I, who had inherited the throne in 1603, treated her with cautious kindness at first. She was welcome at court. She had her grandmother's money. She had her freedom. But freedom for Arbella came too late. In 1610, she secretly married William Seymour, a young nobleman with his own claim to the throne. The marriage was precisely the kind of unauthorized dynastic alliance that Elizabeth and Bess had spent decades trying to prevent. James was furious. Arbella was placed under house arrest. Seymour was imprisoned in the Tower. They attempted to escape together. Seymour got out. Arbella did not. She was captured in the English Channel, trying to flee to France. She was brought back to the Tower, and she never left. Arbella Stewart died in the Tower of London in 1615. She was 39 years old. The official cause of death was illness, but contemporaries understood the truth. Arbella had refused to eat. She had starved herself to death in a stone cell. A woman whose grandmother had started with nothing and built everything, and whose granddaughter had everything and could keep nothing. She was the cost of Bess's ambition made human. The dynastic machine had produced her, positioned her, controlled her, and finally consumed her. And the glass house on the Derbyshire Ridge, where Arbella had spent her youth staring out through those enormous windows at a world she could not reach, stood unchanged. Chapter 10. The Woman Who Wrote Her Own Epitaph. Bess died on the 13th of February, 1608, and the inscription on her tomb said exactly what she told it to say. She was roughly 80 years old, perhaps 87. The uncertainty about her birth date, the same uncertainty that had followed her from a childhood too minor to be precisely recorded, meant that even her death could not pin down the length of her life. She died at Hardwick, in the house she built, in the room she had designed for herself at the top of the building, with the tallest ceilings and the most glass, looking out over the countryside she had spent 60 years acquiring. Local legend held that Bess could not die as long as she kept building. The frost of the winter of 1607 was so severe that construction work stopped. The mortar would not set. The workmen could not function, and Bess, as though the cessation of building had broken whatever force kept her alive, declined and died. It is a good story. It is almost certainly not true. But the fact that people told it reveals how thoroughly Bess had merged her identity with the act of construction. In the minds of her neighbors, she was not a person who built houses. She was a force that manifested as building. Stop the building and you stopped Bess. Her tomb at All Saints Church in Derby, now Derby Cathedral, carries an inscription that she composed herself. It is a precise accounting of her achievements, her 4 marriages, her children, her titles, her buildings. It is not modest. Bess had never been modest. It reads as a final entry in the ledger she had been keeping since she was a girl with 26 pounds and no future. In her final years, Bess had done what she always did. She managed. She disinherited her eldest son Henry, who had defied her over Arbella, and she settled the bulk of her estate on her second son William, whom she trusted to maintain what she had built. William would become the first Earl of Devonshire. His descendants would become dukes. The Cavendish family would remain one of the great families of England for the next 4 centuries. The 1601 inventory she had commissioned catalogued every object in Hardwick Hall, every tapestry, every portrait, every piece of furniture, every cushion and candlestick and curtain. It is one of the most complete records of an Elizabethan household in existence, and it serves a purpose beyond historical record-keeping. It was Bess's way of freezing her world in place. If every object was recorded, then the house could be maintained exactly as she left it. Nothing could be moved. Nothing could be lost. Her will would persist in the arrangement of furniture long after her body was in the ground. One more life ended at Hardwick, decades later, that deserves mention. Thomas Hobbes, the philosopher who wrote Leviathan, one of the foundational texts of modern political theory, spent his final years as a guest of the Cavendish family and died at Hardwick in 1679. The man who theorized about the nature of power spent his last days in a house built by a woman who had practiced it. Bess was gone. But the Cavendishes were already making a decision that would have infuriated her. They were leaving Hardwick behind. They chose Chatsworth as their principal seat. The house Bess had been forced to abandon during her war with Shrewsbury became the house her descendants preferred. Hardwick, the monument she had built to outlast everything, was already becoming secondary. The glass palace on the ridge was not forgotten, but it was no longer the center. Chapter 11. Saved by Neglect. The very thing that would have enraged Bess, her family's indifference, is the reason her house survived 4 centuries virtually untouched. The Cavendishes kept Hardwick. They maintained it. They used it occasionally as a secondary residence, a place for younger sons or widowed mothers. But they never modernized it. They never redecorated it. They never knocked out walls or added wings or replaced the Elizabethan interiors with Georgian plasterwork or Victorian wallpaper. Hardwick was left, essentially, as Bess had left it. This was not preservation through reverence. It was preservation through neglect. The family simply did not care enough about Hardwick to spend money changing it. Their attention and their fortune went to Chatsworth, which was rebuilt in the 17th century, expanded in the 18th, and filled with the finest art collections in England. Chatsworth was the showpiece. Hardwick was the spare. But this indifference was a gift, because it meant that when architectural historians and preservationists began taking interest in England's great houses in the 19th century, they found at Hardwick something almost miraculous. An Elizabethan house with its original floor plan, its original plasterwork, its original tapestries still hanging on the original walls. The 1601 inventory could be used to identify objects that were still in the same rooms where Bess had placed them 300 years earlier. The 6th Duke of Devonshire, in the early 19th century, recognized what he had. He began careful conservation work, not restoration, not renovation, but conservation. He stabilized the building without altering it. He understood that Hardwick's value lay precisely in its unchanged state. The house survived 2 world wars. During World War II, Hardwick served as a training facility for paratroopers. Young soldiers practiced their jumps from the roof of Bess's glass palace. It is an extraordinary image. Men preparing to be dropped into occupied Europe, launching themselves from the towers that still bore the initials ES. The house endured the wartime use without serious damage, largely because the military treated it with more care than might have been expected. Duchess Evelyn, wife of the 9th Duke, served as a quiet custodian during the mid-20th century. She lived at Hardwick during the war years and maintained the property with a careful, unflashy competence that Bess herself would have recognized. But the crisis that had been building for decades arrived in 1950. The 10th Duke of Devonshire died, and the death duties were catastrophic. The tax rate on inherited wealth had reached 80%. The Cavendish estate owed the Treasury millions. Something had to go. Hardwick went. The house and its contents were surrendered to the Treasury in lieu of tax. This was not a donation. It was a seizure dressed in the polite language of estate settlement. The Cavendishes gave the government a 400-year-old house because they could not afford to keep it and pay what the government demanded. In 1959, Hardwick was transferred to the National Trust. The glass palace that Bess had built as a private declaration of personal triumph now belonged to the nation. The public could walk through the high, great chamber. They could stand in the long gallery. They could look up at the ES initials on the towers and learn the name of the woman who had started with 26 pounds and ended with a monument. By 2019, Hardwick Hall received nearly 300,000 visitors a year. They came from across the world. They walked through rooms that had not fundamentally changed since Bess arranged them in the 1590s. They saw tapestries that had hung in the same positions for 4 centuries. They touched door handles that Bess's servants had touched. The building that was meant as a private declaration of triumph now belongs to everyone. This is an irony that Bess might not have appreciated. She built for her family. She built for her dynasty. She built for the name Cavendish and the letters ES. She did not build for 300,000 strangers in walking boots and waterproof jackets. But she built something that lasted. And in the end, lasting is what she always wanted. Chapter 12. The initials that outlasted the dynasty. 4 centuries later, the letters on the towers still catch the Derbyshire light, and they still spell only her name. Stand at the base of Hardwick Hall on a clear morning and look up. The 6 towers rise above you, each one crowned with the stone parapet that carries those 2 carved letters. E.S. Elizabeth Shrewsbury, the name of a woman who was born Elizabeth Hardwick, who became Elizabeth Barlow, then Elizabeth Cavendish, then Elizabeth St. Lo, and finally Elizabeth Talbot, Countess of Shrewsbury. She chose, at the summit of her life, to be identified by the title of her most difficult marriage. Not her birth name, not the name of the husband she loved, the name that signified the highest rank she achieved, the name that placed her among the aristocracy she had spent her entire life climbing toward. The dynasty she built did endure, but not at Hardwick. The Cavendishes became the Dukes of Devonshire. They made Chatsworth one of the finest houses in England. They produced politicians, soldiers, patrons of the arts. They are still there, still at Chatsworth, still titled, still wealthy. But they are Chatsworth's family now, not Hardwick's. Hardwick belongs to history. The 1601 inventory is still used by the National Trust to manage the collection. Curators can match objects on the shelves to entries in a 400-year-old document. The embroideries that Bess and Mary Queen of Scots stitched together are still in the house. The Gideon tapestries still hang in the high great chamber. The long gallery still stretches 166 feet along the east front, still hung with portraits, and still flooded with light from windows that Bess designed and Smithson Drew and unnamed glaziers fitted into their leading 4 centuries ago. The false windows are still there too. On the exterior, some of the windows are backed not by rooms, but by stone walls. Bess installed them for symmetry. She wanted the facade to be perfect, even if it meant placing glass in front of stone, light in front of nothing. Appearance mattered more than function. The illusion of openness mattered more than actual openness. This detail tells you more about Bess than any biography. She would rather build a false window than admit an imperfection. The deepest revelation of Hardwick Hall is structural, not decorative. Bess could only build freely when her husbands were dead. Either the doctrine of coverture meant that everything she owned during marriage belonged to her husband. She could plan, she could influence, she could redirect and persuade and manipulate. But she could not act independently. Only widowhood gave her full legal autonomy. Only the deaths of her husbands gave her the freedom to build. Hardwick Hall is, in the most literal sense, a building made possible by the deaths of 4 men, 26 pounds. That was where it started. An infant girl in a cold Derbyshire manor, with a dead father and a future that held nothing. She married a boy who died. She married a man who stole from monasteries and died. She married a soldier who loved her and died. She married an earl who hated her and died. And from each death, she extracted wealth, freedom, and the raw material for what she would build next. Was she admirable? She was extraordinary. Was she ruthless? Without question. She built during a famine. She caged her granddaughter. She disinherited her eldest son. She fought every battle with the cold calculation of a woman who had learned, at the age of 1, that the world would take everything if you let it. But she also built something beautiful. She built something that has stood for 400 years on a windy Derbyshire ridge, catching the light, holding the gaze of everyone who passes. She built a house that says, to every person who looks at it, I was here, I mattered, you cannot erase me. The famine ended, the dynasty moved on. The queen who kept Mary prisoner died. The earl who besieged Chatsworth died. The granddaughter who carried royal blood starved herself in a tower. All of them are gone, but the letters are still there. ES cut into stone, silhouetted against the sky, belonging now not to a countess, but to the world. Bess of Hardwick started with nothing. She built everything. And 400 years later, the only name on the building is hers.